We're discussing, on the one hand, shame and guilt, white guilt, but those are not the same things as responsibility. And that's why I made the point of how, the crises, the multi-crises that the world is going through at the moment, how much that points us to the importance of responsibility, because I certainly think we need to move away from the whole white guilt narrative that does absolutely nothing for anyone. And in fact, an apology that came from a place of shame by people who aren't directly responsible for wrongdoings is not as a sincere
why not?
apology.
Why isn't it sincere? It could easily be sincere. So my brother, for instance, went to get a German passport at the German embassy, which he was entitled to because, like your family, my father's family were persecuted by the Nazis. And he thought it would be a completely bureaucratic procedure. And instead, he was welcomed into this grand stateroom by a woman who said, "I want to personally apologize for everything that my country did to your family." And he nearly burst into tears. It was the most wonderful, therapeutic thing. Now, she hadn't done it, but she was taking responsibility for something so it was sincere. It was very sincere on her part.
Okay, that
and
is
he took
sincere,
it sincerely.
and it's a beautiful story which actually demonstrates how important and healing an apology can be. I just think on a systemic level, I mean, when individuals make those kinds of gestures, they definitely can be sincere and meaningful. But on a systemic level, what we're looking for is perhaps even more than an apology, is an acknowledgement, because that involves acknowledging that the wrongdoings are still continuing to create so much suffering for people who suffered at the legacies of land grabbing and land theft. So I just think we really need to make a distinction between guilt and responsibility. Also because guilt quite often leads to a kind of white guilt specifically, leads to a kind of self-flagellating, like, oh, we did such terrible things, and and
what's wrong with that?
It doesn't mitigate the suffering that people are experiencing. So I'm frequently told similar kinds of comments as your brother-in-law did. When white people say, "Oh, I feel guilty for the colonization that happened in Nigeria, a country where I'm from." I would much rather have a conversation about what can we do, what kind of institutions could be set up so that people in Nigeria today don't have to have Western waste dumped into our country.
So you're saying it's necessary but not sufficient. But
Absolutely.
I hope you're saying it's necessary that we should at least acknowledge and apologize for what happened, surely.
It's necessary, but a distinction needs to be made between guilt and responsibility, between
Absolutely.
shame and responsibility.
Okay, so let's move on to that, because having acknowledged, I mean, not all nations have, some have acknowledged what went wrong. What then needs to be done? And is it feasible to give land back to people who had it stolen from them generations ago? So I'll start with you on the actual practicalities of it.
So the first thing that's important to understand is that, land is the actual sort of soil that provides people with food, and that holds sites that are sacred for people historically in terms of knowledge and things like that, is not the same notion of land that I think quite often this discussion is about. When we're talking about borders and boundaries and nation states. So the land itself doesn't care that, we call it Nicaragua or America or Indonesia. These are human denominations. And we need to make that distinction first, so that we understand that what we are giving back is that sense of honoring the land, I'll leave it.
But you actually think we should be where does it end? Does the whole of the US go back to the indigenous people who first lived there and owned it?
Of course not. That isn't feasible.
So how do we, just practically, what actually should happen?
Practically, we set up, so first, as I outlined in the beginning, first of all, an apology does need to be made, an acknowledgement. And then debt cancellation is one thing that is a huge part of reparations. And then institutions need to be set up that are tackling the political and the economic causes and consequences of suffering still today, and as well as institutions that are tackling the cultural and the spiritual factors that are causing so much suffering today. And we really have to understand that if we don't do this, all of the crises that we collectively face, we aren't going to be able to meet them, because this challenge and this anger and frustration and suffering continues to linger. So institutions is basically what needs to be set up, and some of those will be giving finances, will be cancelling debt, but many of them will also be about encouraging wellness and even just thinking about how seeds, people who are fighting for seed freedom around the world, so that women particularly, who want to be able to feed their children organic, wholesome food, which at the moment is being targeted only for, pretty much for white Western people. So all of these questions are so connected, and I think we need to set up institutions that are really looking at how to fix that.
But I notice that none of those proposals actually include giving land back, actual physical land back.
Well, that's why I made the distinction between what we mean when we say it's not giving a nation back, but it is giving soil back. It is honoring sacred sites. It is.
But they can't till the soil if someone else is living on it.
No, but we can see to it that, for example, in the Amazon, indigenous groups are being forced out of where they live. Those kinds of things.
So that's present-day sins. I'm talking about past sins, i.e., land that was taken away from people 200 years ago. Too late to give it back to them.
As we know, with the kind of Palestine-Israel question, giving land back is in those kinds of concrete terms is a very difficult thing to do, but. We do have to look at the alternative ways, at least that it can symbolically be given back.
Okay. Rana and then Eric.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to say, actually, I think there's an argument, and I claim no expertise on this whatsoever, for a really quite granular and hard-headed look at land use. Because one of the things that's changed most dramatically, I would say, in the last 150 years, is the way in which land, broadly speaking, if we're talking about North America in particular, is used in agricultural terms, in partly because of the Green Revolution and also genetic modification, and the way in which crops are actually grown. The term tilling the land, etc., it's a wonderful romantic term. It doesn't really describe the reality of what agricultural land use is in many places these days, which is very large industrialized type of farming with large mechanized and often larger and larger use of artificial intelligence in terms of how the land is actually sown. Also the types of seeds and so forth that are used, as the current Ukraine crisis shows, where one of the world's great land, advanced agricultural land uses is currently being destroyed because of an invasion and a war. So it seems to me that using a law commission in each particular jurisdiction, in which you have a combination of people who are expert in the existing form of civil land use law and various types of indigenous title right, which is now a very well-established type of land usage law regime in a lot of countries around the world, you essentially work out some version of what that kind of land that was taken 150 years ago essentially has in terms of value now, and how that can be equitably and reasonably turned into whatever it is: money, education costs, the ability to actually invest in new technologies and things which are useful now. And you will also get a completely different outcome in each different place. A country like Canada, which has huge, sort of waving wheat fields even now, and prairies, sorry for the cliche there, but broadly speaking too, it's completely different from Australia. And I don't want to sort of, kind of spoil anyone's illusions here, but the whole of the centre of Australia is basically desert. It is only indigenous peoples who have had very, very long experience of that land, who know how to work across it, travel across it, hear its signals, hear its way of life. The answer to Australia's land justice question is going to be a very different one to those of Native Canadians and Native Americans. And I think giving one universalized solution would actually be as much a form of imperialism as simply saying there's no problem there in the first place at all.
Eric?
Yeah, I just sort of want to step back to this question of giving land back as an international norm, because I do think we have to be a bit more cognizant of the flow of history over time and over space globally, right? The flow of history up until the advent of international law, starting with Westphalia, but certainly going forward to Versailles, was one of essentially empires conquering various groups, including hunter-gatherer societies, I mean, that was Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, was essentially all about agriculturalists conquering hunter-gatherers in Africa, in North America, etc. So you have a pretty bloody history of territorial revision. And if we're going to go back and relitigate all that and try and give land back, I mean, it's worth saying that a lot of that has been behind the two world wars. The start of the First and Second World Wars were all about these grievances about, you stole this land, we want it back, you didn't give it back, we're going to invade. I mean, what are we opening up, I suppose, is the question that I would ask, right? Is that if we're getting people to marinate in these old grievances, I mean, if you look at, Israel-Palestine is one example, I mean, the current conflict is another example. Sri Lanka with the Tamils, who was here first, whose land is it really? We want things to be the way they were in this particular year. I just think we're really opening up, we're going into a place that is not a good place, and I think it'd be better to acknowledge, as you say, the shame and sins of the past, absolutely, but not to sort of talk about territorial revision.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below, or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.